Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, Senior Fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is Representative Jim Cooper. Congressman Cooper represents Tennessee's 5th Congressional District, which consists of Nashville and some of its suburbs. He announced earlier this year that he's retiring after 3 decades in Congress, after his district was gerrymandered. Representative Cooper chairs the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee. He sits on the Intelligence Committee, and of most interest to our audience today, he's a longtime member of the Budget Committee. Representative Cooper is an attorney and has taught health policy at Vanderbilt University's Business School. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event's being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website in the near future. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Representative Cooper, welcome to The Prescription. Congressman, we can't hear you. I think you need to.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Thank you, Howard. I'm honored to be with you. And I see that Tracy Gordon is in the audience. I'm a big fan of hers too. So y'all do great work.
Great. Thank you very much. And she's a big fan of yours, I know. So I want to talk to you a little bit about politics and then something about the budget. And then maybe we'll talk a little bit about Ukraine. You're a longtime Blue Dog Democrat. You're a moderate in a deepening sea of partisanship. Over the past 20 years, if my numbers are right, the number of Blue Dogs in the House fell from nearly 60 to about 20. So what's happened to Congress over the last 3 decades?
Well, 60 was an all-time high, so 20 is a more reasonable number. And as you know, the number of swing seats has declined. It used to be about 120 swing seats. Now the Cook Political Report has it at about 35 swing seats. And that may be an exaggeration. Congress is just a reflection of the American people. And as we've sorted ourselves by state and by district, and gerrymandering has compounded that sorting, it makes it harder to reach across the aisle. But the good news is in the House gym and places where there are no cameras, people still get along pretty darn well. The cameras actually hurt their behavior.
And here we are on camera, so what can I say? Is there still a place for social moderates and fiscal conservatives like you in American politics today?
There is, and there will always be, because whether you're a conservative Democrat or a liberal Republican, we are the so-called majority makers. The country is not so polarized yet that the extremes can have anything like a majority. You have to reach out to the independents and the undecideds, and that's what we do. We're able to talk to everybody as we should, and I think that function will never disappear from American politics, although it's hurting right now.
You know, but what I hear all the time is to win a primary, you have to really go to the extreme because those are the people who vote in primaries. Is that right?
But there's several, that's true, but there are several ways to correct that. If we had more politically aware voters who didn't just vote in presidential elections, then we would have fewer extremist forces. Also, what we really need to do is return to the secret ballot. People forget that you can only gerrymander if you know how people are going to vote. And firms like Cambridge Analytica have so deprived us of a secret ballot that really that enables a lot of political mischief to happen.
So what do you do? What did you try to do to get moderates, younger voters to the polls? You know, they talk, they go on Instagram, they complain. Polls show that people want politicians reaching across the aisle, but when it comes to voting, they don't show up. How do you get them out?
Well, I've tried all the usual things, and quite frankly, it barely works. We registered more young people than had ever been registered in Nashville, Davidson County, but even the registered don't go out and vote. And part of it is by design. In Tennessee, our primary is on a Thursday in August, and that's one of the least convenient times and one of the hottest days of the year. So this is by design. There's an art form to manipulating elections and gerrymandering. But on top of that, I think that as the crisis deepens, more and more Americans are aware of the stakes. My mother-in-law actually prays for the safety of our democracy and has for 2 years. And that prayer is being uttered in more and more churches and synagogues as people realize the danger. And of course, they saw January 6th. So the greatest thing about America is our resilience, our stabilizing mechanism. You know, Churchill said we'd always do the right thing after we've exhausted all the alternatives. We're pretty close to exhausting the alternatives right now. So, but we will return to our senses.
I hope you're right. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the budget. So when you came to Congress 30 years ago, the public debt was about 40% of GDP, and now it's 100% of GDP. How did we let this happen?
Well, two immediate causes. One was COVID, where free spending was encouraged, and we probably overdid that. The second one was the recovery from the '08 housing crisis, which was largely a capitalist self-inflicted wound. So that double whammy really enabled people in the Democratic Party to escape their pay-as-you-go vow, which is one of the best things in modern fiscal policy, but largely it's not even a lukewarm admonition today. And Republicans they really wanted cut your taxes and devil take the hindmost. So it's really combined irresponsibility. I think Rand Paul may have said it best, and I'm not in the habit of quoting Rand, but he said, when Democrats are in the majority, Republicans are the conservative party. When Republicans are in the majority, there is no conservative party. And we've got to be careful because their image of restraint is not deserved. They've actually been bigger spenders on entitlement programs than Democrats have.
So you mentioned budget process, pay as you go. I know you've worked very hard on budget process over the years, but is this really a problem of process, or is this really a lack of will?
It's basically a lack of will. Sometimes process can help, but basically folks back home really don't care, and they don't understand. They've given up on balancing, and we all forget the 3 great years under Clinton when we actually achieved a balanced budget, and Alan Greenspan was worried about the Treasury bond disappearing. Well, we solved that problem. So in the Nashville area in the last 24 months, they've been given almost $10 billion. That's to individuals, companies, and programs. That's an extraordinary amount of money, and 0 people are grateful for that. Whether it's the stimulus checks, the PPP loans, or the incredible grants to the healthcare industry, which is headquartered in Nashville, they just take it for granted. It's like, what have you done for me lately? And that's we've got to get a handle on things because we're pushing the limits of America's fiscal capacity at this point.
Did we go too far knowing what we knew then? I mean, clearly in hindsight, we went too far, but based on what we knew then, did we make the right choices?
Well, the traditional admonition for the Fed is remove the punch bowl right as the parties get started. So the Fed was late. Congress has been late. Now, we don't get credit actually for having prevented a recession in America during COVID. We probably had the best economic performance of any advanced nation, but our healthcare performance was not so good. So it's a crazy thing, politics, because people are going to do what they want. There's no way to repeal the business cycle. If you overjuice the economy, you're going to pay the consequences, and that we're facing some of that now.
And I guess voters, like everybody else, ask, what have you done for me lately?
Even though most of the statistics are pretty darn good, normally if you had a low unemployment rate, that was considered excellent work. One of the pundits called this a vibe recession because people just kind of want to be depressed now. We've coped with $5 gasoline before. That's not the most important indicator in the economy, but people often take it that way. I wish people would check the price of candy bars when they do that, because as you know, the business model for gas stations is not to sell gas. That's just to get you into the C-store so that you'll buy all the junk food, which Americans have not restrained themselves from doing.
It's interesting that when people are surveyed, they say the economy is terrible, yet their personal finances they seem quite happy with, and they keep spending.
Astonishing. And I've had people wonder where their 4th and 5th and 6th stimulus check is. It's like federal money can be addictive. For
sure. So let me ask you, 10 years ago, you and Republicans, Steve Tourette, introduced a bipartisan plan to reduce spending by about $3 trillion over 10 years, raise taxes by about $1.2 trillion. Your plan roughly tracked the Bowles-Simpson plan, but neither of those went anywhere. So you alluded to this before, but what's it going to take to get Democrats to agree to spending cuts and Republicans to agree to tax increases?
Well, you're talking like the Boy Scout that you are. And by the way, Bowles and Simpson wanted it called Simpson-Bowles because otherwise the acronym would be BS. But that was the largest bipartisan deficit reduction plan in modern American history. Absolutely necessary, but we only got 38 votes because people knew it wasn't going to pass and they didn't want to walk the plank if they weren't going to be victorious. So the number of fiscally minded folks is actually much greater than the 38 votes would indicate, but we have not really strengthened our numbers. And still it's easy to promise things that you can't possibly deliver. So I don't know what it's going to take to have a fiscal reality check. In a sense, America has coasted on our reputation because we're bad, but other nations seem to be worse. The dollar is still the reserve currency. Not even Trump was able to blow up free trade completely. So it's amazing the cushion that's been allowed to us, but we're experiencing a much thinner cushion than certainly we faced immediately after World War II.
So for a long time, many of us, you did, I did, predicted that high deficits and debt would inevitably lead to higher interest rates. And they didn't. For 30 years, we were wrong. Now interest rates are rising. Do you think that's going to motivate Congress to address the mismatch between revenues and spending?
Well, rates are rising, but remember, we were in a prolonged bubble. So this is called returning to normal. For young people to think that a 2 or 3% mortgage is normal, well, I wish I'd grown up in that era. And see, that's another way they took it for granted. Now, we don't want abnormally high rates, but wasn't the British Treasury policy for 300 years a 2% inflation rate? But it's hard to manage fire once you start burning, especially when there's a lot of dry tinder around. And that seems to be the central mistake that perhaps Jerome Powell made, perhaps Congress has made. But it's very difficult for Congress to adjust fiscal policy. You know, the infrastructure bill was long overdue. That's multi-year spending. That's not immediate spending. And so things like that had to be done. And to give Biden credit, he's the first president in 30 years to be able to get it done because of his personal relationships. His patience is extraordinary. His talent for spotting the key issues that will move an otherwise unpersuadable member of the Senate he's remarkable. But these are tough partisan times. So it's hard to look remarkable in these heavily partisan times.
You know, you're talking to somebody whose first mortgage was 13%. So I understand what you're talking about. But you know, the argument always was that you could not get public support for dealing with the deficit because there was no consequence to the public. The interest rates were still very low and nobody cared. So now rates are rising, although for reasons probably not having much to do with the government policy. Is it an opportunity to change the discussion and get Congress more interested in focusing on dealing with the deficit?
I think it is an opportunity once debt service starts being one of the largest programs in federal government, because it will multiply in size as rates go up. Once we realize that oftentimes we're servicing foreign creditors and they actually come before American citizens, that's astonishing. But let's face it, so many Americans took treasury bonds out of their portfolio a long time ago. And foreigners have oftentimes believed more in us than we have believed in ourselves. Tax policy is vitally important. That's one reason I wanted to be on your podcast today, because I was reminded this week by historian H.W. Brands that the American Revolution was largely caused by bad tax policy. You know, revolutions happen if you're not taxing the right things and if people don't understand the system. So I've always worried that by taxing income, we're discouraging people from making income, you know, and we're used to that system. So often we can't even think of another way around it. But there's got to be a fundamental rethinking of our tax policy. And I don't know whether we'll move to a VAT or tax the internet or what, but, you know, if we just had some sort of fee on GPS, that's probably the greatest gift to mankind ever in human history. It's worth trillions of dollars, and we never even thought of charging for it. And that was largely a military system that donated to the world that literally helps billions of people every day in a vital way. And it's not just locational. We couldn't have ATMs without that. And that's a good example of American technology, American inventiveness that we've gotten zero credit for. Oftentimes drug discoveries are a similar way, and only Americans pay those high prices, not the people in other nations. So there are infinite ways to rebase the revenue stream in a way that would be perceived as much fairer by the average American.
So there's a couple of ways to tax consumption. One of them was the value-added tax, as you suggested. Another way is a carbon tax. Is that
Absolutely.
something that you think would be appropriate?
I've long favored that. It makes good sense to tax externalities. You know, folks like Greg Mankiw at Harvard, you can be a member of his Pigovian society by taxing externalities. But see, the literacy of these issues is approaching zero right now in the public and sometimes in Congress. Our favorite tool is the tax expenditure, which is one of the least efficient tools in our toolbox. So we've got to get a handle on this, and most members are clueless. We just saw an example of this when we were trying to cut childhood poverty in half, but we did it with a tax credit that no one, not even the beneficiaries, appreciated. So that program is already terminated. One of the boldest and most enlightened initiatives of all of American history. And it lasted, what, just a few months.
You, I know, are a fan of the child tax credit. Would you bring back the monthly payments and the larger credit?
Well, it has to be explained and delivered in a way that people understand. And that's much better done by a direct check. And I wouldn't mind if Joe Biden signed the check or whoever's the president. But this tax thing, as soon as you mention the T word in today's poisonous environment, you've lost at least half your audience, maybe 3/4, because they simply do not understand. They will never understand how the IRS can write them a check. So we fought this battle for years with the earned income tax credit. Nashville has more volunteer tax preparers than probably any city in America. We think that should be a service provided free, but of course, H&R Block, Jackson Hewitt, other preparers, and the tax software companies are against that. So it's actually a Reagan initiative back from years ago before computers were as good as they are now, to have the IRS prepare your own return, give it to you free. You could choose to prepare your own if you want, but here it's all done for you, because for 80% of America, it's 1099s, it's W-2s. This is easily done. So the IRS already has that data, but they only have that data to catch you. They don't have that data to help you. So that's a good example of how, using the theory of nudge, you could turn that whole thing around and maybe even have a popular IRS. Wouldn't that be nice? But remember, we'd still be taxing the wrong thing, because we want more income, smaller incomes.
One of our former colleagues at the Minnesota Fed has recently done a study that shows that the IRS could accurately pre-populate about 40% of returns, and for low income people, accurately do it for about 70%.
And wouldn't that remove a headache? And you know, I've had that bill for a few years now. You know how many co-sponsors I've got? Almost zero. Yeah. It's just astonishing. And I tell my Republican friends, this is a Reagan idea. But see, Reagan today would be a Democrat. The party has shifted so far right. But again, just mentioning the T word clouds people's thinking so much, they're unable to sometimes reach a rational conclusion.
It's an interesting thing, you know, for a long time, it seems that Congress was afraid to do direct spending for social safety net programs, and they turned it all into tax subsidies. And now we're in a situation where we're arguing about, Senator Romney's got a proposal now, we're arguing about exactly how to design those tax subsidies. But that seems to be where the debate is now, on taxes and not direct spending.
You're exactly right. Basically, power shifted from the Appropriations Committee to the Ways and Means Committee. And Ways and Means and Finance, Senate Finance, have not sometimes handled that responsibility as well as we might like.
Let me ask you about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Of course, it cut taxes for all income groups, but largely for high-income households and corporations. President Biden's proposed raising taxes for those groups, but so far, at least, the proposals have gone nowhere in the Senate. Do you think they're a good idea? Should we be rolling back the TCJA, or at least in some other ways, taxing higher income people?
Well, we need more social equality. We have the greatest inequality since the 1920s, and you don't have to read Piketty to believe this. You see it all around you. But we have to achieve a fairer system above all, and one that most all Americans can buy into. I don't want to punish success, but I do believe that billionaires could be doing more to pay their fair share. And as we learn, it's not the theoretical rate, it's the effective tax rate that matters. And when so many giant corporations, for example, are not paying anything, much less their fair share, that just seems like they're free riding on the American economy. And when they're doing nothing to keep our system strong, which is the greatest system for wealth creation in the history of the world, then they're completely free riders. So it used to be that some of the wealthy corporations would help. For example, AT&T used to run Sandia Labs for $1 a year. That was kind of their obligation. Now, sure, they had at the time a technological monopoly, but there's got to be a way to burden share in a more fair way. And I think the best way to do this is to start with something that's not just beating the old drum of income tax, because we all know the tricks there. And we all know the difficulty of even repealing complexities like the capital gains, because people are so bought into their favorite loophole, they think they own it. In fact, they think it's in the Constitution.
What about a wealth tax like Sanders and Elizabeth Warren would do? Do you think that would work?
Well, it's fun in theory, but how in practice would you do it? And when stocks go up, that looks great. But when stocks go down, are you going to write those folks a check back for what you've already taxed? So a lot of government is practicality. And I'm a big subscriber to the tools of government theory, as I always already alluded to with the ineffectiveness of most tax expenditures. They're just not efficient. And why waste 9 out of $10? So we have to fit the tool for the problem. And it takes a lot more conceptualization. Probably the easiest thing to do would be to shift to a VAT, but Republicans right now are totally against that, because that would actually give the government adequate revenues.
Right.
And wouldn't that be a terrible thing? But Democrats can't just be the party of government. We've got to be a party of the government that works. And we've lagged on civil service reform. We've lagged on reforming some of these agencies. And sometimes the Republicans, as I mentioned too, with this Reagan taxpayer idea to have the IRS do it, sometimes Republicans have not wanted government to work efficiently. But let's face it, both parties are guilty of these things. Both parties can be anti-science. Both parties can be for a mess. And it's just, we need an honesty session so that we can get down to basics and make everything work better.
So the president's changed his rhetoric a little bit lately. During the campaign and through his first year in office, he framed tax increases as a way to pay for new social spending. Now he's increasingly describing those tax hikes as a tool to reduce the deficit. From your point of view, is that a good shift in emphasis?
Well, very few people care about deficit reduction in the abstract. You and I might, but most people can't tell you that the debt now is at World War II levels and that it's a little bit above 100% of GNP. In fact, GNP, as you know, is a very crude measure in and of itself. That Bobby Kennedy speech at the University of Kansas was still brilliant in the way it helps capture what GNP does not capture. So in general, you have to lead in a way that people understand. I call politics putting the cookies on a low shelf. And sometimes we're not doing that. And sometimes we're offering them broccoli and not cookies. So we've got to be more artful. And President Biden is as skillful and as experienced as any politician in American history. But these are parlous times. And I liken it a little bit to the McCarthy era. And finally, the fever broke. But we had an advantage in that McCarthy was an alcoholic from Wisconsin. And we've had other problems. And sometimes I wish some of my enemies would be big drinkers so they'd be less likely to endure. But social media and for-profit media of all types definitely contribute to this, because for many of our average Americans, 80% of my folks didn't go to college, didn't want to go to college. They're inundated by all this trash. And I'd probably think like they do if that's all I saw. It's very difficult. Jefferson was asked the fundamental question, would he rather see government without newspapers or newspapers without government? And he said he would unhesitatingly choose the latter. So now we're living Jefferson's nightmare of a government without newspapers. And that's a terrible thing. It's a shocking turn of events, because content is as valuable as ever before, but content providers are not able to be rewarded in a fair and good way. So the knowledge has sunk. The New York Times used to be published at the 11th or 12th grade level. Now it's more like the 7th grade level. And that's the New York Times. Oh my God, most Americans, their local papers are 3rd or grade or below. So it's very difficult to have a sustained discussion. When I was a student in England years ago, the readership was so informed that they could routinely mention measures of the money supply, M1, M2, M3, and the readership knew what that meant. Like, imagine doing that in this country. That's like naming, the name of a ruler of a third world country. Americans have no idea. In fact, we can't find them on the map. So we've got to up our game, because if we're going to continue to be a world power, we need to start acting like it. And that means long-range plans, including finance plans, so that you have a solid and sustained economy, regardless of what hits you in the future.
So it sounds like what you're really talking about is a problem with education in this country.
Amen.
We're not educating young kids the way we should.
I've had the largest and most rigorous internship program on Capitol Hill. In the last 20 years alone, I've had over 600 interns. And guess what? Hardly any of them today can write. And I'm not talking English as a second language. I'm talking about their native tongue. Somewhere they're not learning it. And so I tell them, you may be Einstein, but unless you put it on the page, I can't tell if you're Einstein or not. And it's really crippling when you cannot express yourself in a clear, simple way. So we actually start with letters home. I give them a chance to do a real paper. And when they fail miserably at that, I say, write a letter home. Many of them have never written a letter home. They've texted, they've called,
Yeah.
they have no idea what it's like. Some of them use English. They've tried to remember from Shakespeare. You know, the common vernacular is fine. Talk like people talk today.
Sure.
Use hip hop lyrics. I don't care, but communicate. And it's a little bit like the Tower of Babel problem. If we're no longer able to talk sensibly and carefully to each other, then we're all in trouble. I just am coming from a huge argument I had on the House floor with a colleague who's unbelievably anti-science and proud of it. And his constituents must like that because he continually gets reelected.
Yeah, the other thing that frustrates me is talk about science, talk about finance. People can't do math, and how can you have these conversations with people who can't do basic arithmetic?
I tell people if money grew on trees, I'd have a big orchard. They probably would too. But it's certain theories are so convenient, and I'm not an expert on modern monetary theory and things like that. But if it's too good to be true, it probably is. And we have had a cushion, and you can coast on that cushion for a while. But we are in charge of safeguarding our nation, of making sure that we don't ruin our inheritance. And we're some of the most blessed people in all of human history. So let's do a better job of safeguarding our inheritance.
Congressman, we're out of time. Thank you so much for taking a half an hour to talk to me. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for all these years of service. You've been a terrific member of Congress, and your voice has been very important.
Thank you, Howard, and thank Urban, thank Brookings. Y'all are awesome.
Thanks very much. Take care. And thank you to our audience.